I am Audrey Walker, 30 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my mother handed me an invoice for $750,000. She did not mail it quietly. She did not pull me aside into a private room. Instead, she stood at the head of the dining table in her Malibu estate, lowered a 10-foot projector screen, and announced to all 35 of our relatives that she was presenting the true cost of raising a disappointment. She expected me to break down in tears and run out the door, just like I always did when I was younger. But I did not cry. Instead, I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and projected a single photo for everyone to see. By the next morning, 34 of those relatives had blocked her number. The 35th relative was my grandmother, and she did something far worse. Before I tell you what that photo was and what my grandmother did, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Eldenly Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because a public execution like that does not happen overnight. I work as a senior compliance investigator for a fintech firm in Silicon Valley. Numbers make sense to me. They do not lie. They do not play favorites. They do not tell you one thing and mean another. People, on the other hand, especially my family, are a different story. I have paid my own rent and funded my own life since I was 18. My apartment in San Francisco is practical, and I drive a 5-year-old Toyota Corolla. My younger sister Harper, on the other hand, lives in a $2.5 million mansion in La Jolla. Our parents funded her entire life, treating her mere existence as a milestone worthy of celebration, while my actual achievements were treated as inconvenient distractions. Harper is married to Trent, a man who runs a tech incubator that produces nothing but debt and flashy buzzwords. The air in Malibu was crisp when I pulled my Corolla into the sprawling driveway of my parents' oceanfront estate. My sensible car sat surrounded by a sea of pristine Range Rovers and Mercedes SUVs. It was a visual reminder of exactly where I stood in the Walker family hierarchy. I smoothed the wrinkles from my navy blue dress and off-the-rack piece I bought specifically because it would not draw attention, and walked through the heavy double doors. The foyer hummed with the high-pitched, practiced laughter of high society. 35 aunts, uncles, and cousins held crystal flutes of imported champagne. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with expensive perfume. My mother Vivian spotted me instantly. She possessed a radar for my presence, always ensuring she controlled the narrative of my arrival. She wore a tailored emerald suit, her blonde hair styled into an unmoving helmet. "Audrey, darling," she called out, her voice slicing through the chatter. "You made it. We were worried your little car finally gave out on the highway." A few cousins chuckled. I forced a polite smile and told her the car ran fine. She did not step forward to hug me. She simply looked me up and down, her eyes pausing on the hem of my dress just long enough to register her disapproval. Right on cue, Harper glided into the room wearing a custom silk gown, linking arms with Trent. Harper offered me a tight, pitying smile, raising her glass in a silent, mocking toast. I accepted a glass of water, enduring the familiar insults with the detachment I used during corporate audits. I knew my role. I was the designated scapegoat utilized to make Harper shine brighter. I played that part for 30 years to keep the peace. But the dynamic shifted when the caterers ushered us into the grand dining room. Before anyone could pull out a chair, Vivian stepped to the head of the long table. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against her crystal flute. The crisp, ringing sound cut through the ambient noise, demanding immediate silence from all 35 relatives. Family. Vivian began lowering her voice into a solemn theatrical register. "Before we sit down to count our blessings, there is a matter we must address. A heavy maternal burden I can no longer carry in the shadows." She turned and gestured to Trent, who stood waiting by the wall switches. The dining room lights dimmed, and a motorized hum echoed from the front of the room. The mechanical whir of the projector motor sounded unnaturally loud in the hushed dining room. Above the antique marble fireplace, a concealed panel slid backward. A 10-foot white canvas screen descended slowly from the ceiling, unfurling against the dark oak wainscoting. The crystal chandeliers above the long dining table automatically dimmed to a faint amber glow. A ceiling-mounted projector flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright rectangular beam that illuminated the front wall. My mother stepped to the side, allowing the projection to dominate the space. I sat near the middle of the table, flanked by cousins who had stopped breathing. The silence was thick-heavy with the electric anticipation of high society drama. I kept my hands folded perfectly in my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my navy dress. I watched the screen come into focus. An Excel spreadsheet appeared. The text was enlarged crisp and black against the glaring white background. The header centered and bolded read, "The cost of raising a disappointment." A collective intake of breath swept down the 35 chairs. My Uncle Robert, a man who usually never missed an opportunity to speak, lowered his water glass to the table without making a sound. Aunts exchanged wide, terrified glances. The sheer cruelty of the visual was staggering. It was not a subtle insult passed across the gravy boat. It was a calculated, formal presentation designed to humiliate me on the largest possible scale. Vivian turned her back to the screen and locked her eyes directly onto mine. She possessed the polished grace of a seasoned politician stepping up to a podium. She raised a printed copy of the spreadsheet in her manicured hands and began to read, ensuring every single syllable carried to the very back of the room. "Luxury rehabilitation bailouts," she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. $250,000. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Relatives shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed wooden chairs. Some stared down at their untouched porcelain plates, unable to meet my eyes. Others cast sideways, pitying glances in my direction, absorbing the lie as if it were gospel. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the woman who gave birth to me. I simply calculated the audacity of the claim. I do not even drink anything stronger than an occasional glass of white wine with dinner. I have never seen the inside of a rehabilitation clinic. Yet my mother was selling a story of chronic addiction to an audience eager for a scandal. She traced a finger down the printed page, pausing for dramatic effect. Emergency credit card debt eradication. She continued, lowering her pitch to convey profound maternal suffering. $100,000. Another wave of uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the dining room. I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten, but I kept my face entirely neutral. As a compliance investigator, my financial background is subject to rigorous annual reviews. I maintain a pristine 800 credit score. I have never carried a balance past the end of the month in my entire adult life. But the people sitting at this table did not know about my rigorous professional life in Silicon Valley. They only knew the narrative Vivian had fed them for 3 decades. She had spent years laying the groundwork, painting me as irresponsible and reckless, ensuring that when she finally dropped a bomb like this, the family would believe it without asking for receipts. Unappreciated vehicles and living stipends. Vivian read, her voice cracking perfectly on the last word. $400,000. She lowered the paper. She reached into the pocket of her emerald suit and produced a white silk handkerchief. She pressed the fabric gently to the corner of her eye, wiping away an imaginary tear. She stood before the family as the tragic, long-suffering matriarch. She looked like a woman who had sacrificed her own peace, her own comfort, and her own retirement savings to rescue a delinquent daughter from the brink of total ruin. "The grand total sits at exactly $750,000, Vivian whispered into the silent room. "That is the price tag of my eldest daughter." At the head table, seated in the place of honor, my younger sister Harper observed the performance with deep satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, her custom silk gown pooling elegantly around her legs. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her wine glass, hiding a cruel, knowing smirk behind the crystal rim. Beside her, Trent crossed his arms over his chest. He shook his head slowly from side to side, projecting an aura of profound disappointment. He looked directly at me, performing the role of the concerned, responsible brother-in-law. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Trent operated a tech incubator that burned through investor capital without ever launching a single viable product. He and Harper lived in a $2.5 million La Jolla mansion that they could never afford on their own. Yet they sat there passing judgment, acting as if my modest self-funded life was the true drain on the family estate. Vivian folded her silk handkerchief and placed it back into her pocket. The theatrical sorrow vanished from her face, replaced by a rigid, uncompromising authority. She stepped away from the glowing screen and pointed a manicured finger straight down the center of the long table. "Audrey," she commanded, her tone echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I want you to stand up." Every eye in the room pivoted toward me. The cousin sitting next to me physically leaned away, as if my alleged failures were contagious. The dining room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided before the defense was allowed to speak. "I want you to stand up right now," Vivian repeated, her voice rising in volume. "I want you to look at the people who love you. I want you to confess your addictions. I want you to explain why you have bled your parents dry, and I want you to apologize to this family for the shame you have brought into our home." The trap was set. Vivian had orchestrated this exact scenario in her mind 100 times. She knew the mechanics of public shaming. She expected the familiar routine to play out exactly as it had during my childhood. She expected my face to flush bright red. She expected my hands to shake. She anticipated that I would burst into tears, scrape my chair backward against the hardwood floor, and run out the heavy mahogany doors into the cool Malibu night. She wanted the dramatic exit. An empty chair would be her ultimate victory. It would leave her alone in the spotlight, free to spend the rest of the Thanksgiving dinner soaking up the endless sympathy of our wealthy relatives. I did not cry. My hands resting quietly in my lap remained perfectly still. My breathing was slow and measured. I sat in the chair staring at the glowing 10-foot spreadsheet, and my mind shifted away from the emotional cruelty of the moment. I engaged the analytical side of my brain, the part that spends 40 hours a week untangling corporate embezzlement schemes. I looked at the specific numbers Vivian had chosen. $750,000. It was a highly specific figure. It was not a random exaggeration. A sudden sharp clarity pierced through the tension in the room. This presentation was not just a sadistic prank designed to ruin my holiday. It was a strategic maneuver. It was a calculated alibi. Vivian was laying the groundwork for a much larger audit. My grandmother, Beatrice Walker, the formidable 80-year-old matriarch who controlled the overarching generational wealth of our family, was scheduled to review the estate ledgers at the end of the fiscal year. Beatrice was ruthless with the family finances. If money was missing, Beatrice would demand answers. By staging this public execution in front of 35 witnesses, Vivian was building a fortress of lies. She was framing me as a financial parasite. When Beatrice eventually discovered that hundreds of thousands of dollars were missing from the family accounts, Vivian could simply point to the delinquent, addicted eldest daughter. The family would testify that they had seen the bill. They would swear they had witnessed the confession. I realized in that exact moment that my mother was trying to frame me for her own financial crimes. I felt the reassuring weight of my smartphone resting in the pocket of my navy dress. For 3 years, I had been quietly, meticulously building an encrypted dossier of forensic evidence. I had debated keeping those files a secret forever, viewing them merely as an insurance policy in case my mother ever crossed a line she could not uncross. Tonight she had drawn a battle line in 10-foot black ink on a projector screen. The silence in the dining room stretched, tightening like a coiled spring. Vivian stood at the front, waiting for my tears, waiting for my surrender. Trent shifted in his chair, preparing to push the conflict even further, completely unaware that I was already holding the match that would burn their entire kingdom to the ground. The expectation of my collapse hung thick over the catered turkey and imported floral centerpieces. My aunts leaned forward, their silk blouses rustling softly in the quiet dining room, waiting for the inevitable tears to fall. For my entire childhood, Vivian utilized public shaming as her primary weapon of control. If I spilled a glass of milk, she gathered the household to witness my inherent clumsiness. If I earned a B on a high school calculus exam, she announced my lack of focus at neighborhood barbecues, shaking her head in theatrical sorrow. She conditioned me to shrink into the shadows. She conditioned this family to expect my immediate surrender. Tonight, standing beneath the harsh white glow of the projector, she anticipated that same ingrained response. She wanted me to scrape my chair backward against the polished oak floor, cover my flushed face with my hands, and bolt for the heavy mahogany double doors. But I am no longer a frightened teenager desperate for maternal approval. I left this Malibu estate on the morning of my 18th birthday, carrying 2 duffel bags and a singular determination to sever my financial dependence on the Walker name. I funded my own university tuition by working consecutive double shifts at a local logistics firm. I secured my own lease for a practical, quiet apartment in San Francisco without requiring a financial guarantor. My credit score sits at a flawless 800. I do not carry rolling debt. I have never set foot inside a luxury rehabilitation program. My career in Silicon Valley requires a clinical, unyielding adherence to verifiable truth. As a senior compliance investigator, I spend 40 hours a week hunting down corporate embezzlement. I trace hidden assets, untangle complex offshore shell companies, and expose wealthy executives who lie to their shareholders. My daily routine involves hard data, notarized signatures, and immutable banking ledgers. The glowing spreadsheet displayed on the wall above the marble fireplace was not data. It was poorly constructed fiction. I shifted my gaze from the projector screen to the head table, observing the true source of our family's financial drain. Harper took another slow, deliberate sip of her chilled Chardonnay. Her custom silk gown cascaded over her chair, a visual representation of the unearned luxury she enjoyed every single day. While I worked through college, Vivian gifted Harper a brand new luxury SUV for her high school graduation, wrapping it in a giant red bow on the front lawn. When Harper married Trent, my mother purchased them a $2.5 million mansion in La Jolla. The property featured panoramic ocean views, a custom chef kitchen, and a private infinity pool. Vivian fully funded the purchase in cash, disguising the transaction as a modest wedding present. Harper spends her days curating a flawless aesthetic on social media, showcasing imported marble countertops and endless European vacations, entirely oblivious to the actual cost of her pristine lifestyle. Beside her, Trent maintained his posture of manufactured disappointment. Trent called himself an entrepreneur, a title he wore like a designer accessory. He operated a tech incubator down the coast, a flashy enterprise characterized by sleek glass conference rooms, imported espresso machines, and endless rounds of venture capital pitch meetings. But as a forensic investigator, I recognized the stark difference between a thriving business and a polished mirage. Trent's incubator produced 0 viable software. It generated 0 actual revenue. It was a machine designed exclusively to burn through capital, utilizing tech industry buzzwords like synergy and disruption to mask a staggering lack of substance. Trent and Harper were a bottomless sinkhole of expense, maintaining their high society illusions solely because Vivian wrote the checks to keep the collectors at bay. Looking back at the fabricated invoice above the fireplace, the true geometry of my mother's scheme crystallized in my mind. Vivian did not rent a motorized projector and stage a theatrical confrontation merely to ruin my Thanksgiving dinner. Narcissists do not expend this level of effort without a tangible, self-serving goal. This entire spectacle was a calculated alibi. It was a preemptive strike designed to cover her tracks before the ultimate reckoning arrived. That reckoning had a name: Beatrice Walker. My grandmother was the 80-year-old matriarch of the Walker dynasty, a woman who controlled the overarching generational wealth with an iron grip. Beatrice did not build a corporate empire by tolerating fools or funding vanity projects. She possessed a brilliant, ruthless financial mind. She did not care about country club gossip or social optics. She cared exclusively about the ledgers. Every December, Beatrice mandated a comprehensive review of the family estate accounts. She expected the numbers to balance perfectly, down to the final cent. Vivian lived in perpetual terror of her mother-in-law, knowing Beatrice could freeze her access to the primary trusts with a single phone call. Vivian knew the upcoming winter audit would expose a gaping hole in the finances. She had bled the accessible estate accounts dry to sustain Harper and Trent's lavish lifestyle. When Beatrice asked where the money went, Vivian needed a compelling, impenetrable cover story. By assassinating my character in front of 35 witnesses, Vivian was building a fortress of lies. She was painting me as a catastrophic financial parasite. A secret drug addiction and a mountain of emergency credit card debt provided the perfect excuse for hundreds of thousands of missing dollars. She was framing her eldest daughter to protect her golden child and save herself from Beatrice and her wrath. The relatives sitting at this long table were not just an audience enjoying holiday drama. They were her jury. They were the future witnesses she planned to call when the matriarch demanded answers. A cold, steady calm washed over my entire body. I felt the reassuring weight of my smartphone resting deep in the pocket of my navy dress. Vivian believed she held all the cards because she currently controlled the microphone. She assumed my silence was a symptom of shock and humiliation. She did not know that for the past 36 months I had been conducting my own private audit. I had spent 3 years quietly building an encrypted dossier of forensic evidence tracking every routed dollar, every fraudulent account, and every forged signature she thought she had buried under layers of plausible deniability. I had kept the digital files locked away, treating them as a silent insurance policy. Tonight, Vivian had provided the perfect venue to process the claim. I stared at the projector screen, preparing to dismantle her curated reality piece by piece. I planned to strip away the silk and the champagne, leaving nothing but the undeniable documented truth. But before I could pull the phone from my pocket and assume total control of the room, the golden child's husband decided he wanted a turn in the spotlight. Trent leaned forward, placing his elbows heavily on the crisp white tablecloth, eager to twist the knife and demonstrate his loyalty to the woman paying his bills. Trent shifted in his chair, deciding the silence required his personal intervention. He draped one arm over the carved mahogany backrest, projecting an aura of casual authority. He wore a fitted cashmere blazer and a heavy, imported chronograph watch that caught the amber lighting of the dining room. Trent operated on the assumption that his status as a tech incubator chief executive granted him the right to lecture anyone in his vicinity. He viewed himself as a titan of modern industry, despite the stark reality that his business ventures consisted primarily of buzzwords and burned venture capital. Audrey Trent began, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "We all know this is difficult to hear. Nobody likes looking in the mirror when the reflection is ugly." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white linen tablecloth. He steepled his fingers, staring down the length of the table at me with an expression of profound, unearned wisdom. "But you need to stop playing the victim." Trent continued, his voice carrying easily over the muted gasps of the extended family. "You sit there acting like the world owes you a favor while Vivian drains her retirement to keep you out of court. It is pathetic. Stop being a coward. Admit your failures. Take some responsibility for your own life for once, instead of dragging this family down with your endless mistakes." The hypocrisy of his lecture was a tangible force in the room. Trent was a man whose entire existence was subsidized by the woman standing at the projector screen. He drove a luxury sports car he did not purchase. He slept in a La Jolla mansion he did not finance. Yet he felt entirely comfortable weaponizing the concept of personal responsibility against a woman who had funded her own independence since her 18th birthday. Beside him, Harper reached out and placed her hand over his. She offered her husband a look of deep, unified admiration. They were a unified front of parasitic entitlement. Harper did not need to speak a single word to demonstrate her active participation in my destruction. Her silent, glowing approval of Trent's attack spoke volumes. She thrived on the contrast between us. My public humiliation was the fuel that kept her golden child pedestal secure. By actively supporting the fabricated invoice, Harper and Trent proved they were not mere bystanders. They were willing accomplices in Vivian's fortress of lies. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the dining room. My Uncle Robert nodded slowly, his face grim. Aunt Patricia sighed, shaking her head in a display of performative sorrow. The jury had accepted Trent's closing argument. The relatives bought into the narrative without requesting a single shred of verifiable proof. They preferred the comfortable dramatic fiction of my delinquency over the complex, uncomfortable reality of their own family dynamics. Vivian stood near the marble fireplace, her posture rigid and triumphant. She held the projector remote in her manicured hand, waiting for the final act of her orchestrated play. She expected Trent's harsh words to be the catalyst that finally broke my composure. She watched my face, anticipating the sudden flush of shame, the welling of tears, and the inevitable desperate retreat. Instead of defending myself, I reached for the crystal water glass resting near my plate. Condensation had gathered on the outside of the heavy glass, cool and damp against my fingertips. I lifted the rim to my lips and took a slow, measured sip. The water was ice cold. The physical sensation grounded me, tethering my focus to the present moment. I lowered the glass, setting it back onto the wooden table with a soft, definitive clink. I pushed my chair backward. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the polished oak floorboards. The sound acted like a starting pistol. The murmurs died instantly. The 35 relatives held their collective breath, waiting for me to turn on my heel and flee the estate. Vivian relaxed her shoulders, a faint, victorious smile ghosting across her lips. She had won. The scapegoat was leaving the premises, and the narrative was entirely under her control. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy dress. I did not turn toward the heavy double doors leading to the foyer. I did not look at the exit. I stepped out from behind my chair and turned toward the head of the table. My low heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The geography of the long dining room felt miles wide, but I navigated the space with the clinical detachment of a corporate auditor stepping into a hostile boardroom. I walked past Uncle Robert, who frowned in sudden confusion. I walked past Aunt Patricia, whose eyes widened as she realized I was not heading for the front door. Vivian's victorious smile faltered. Her grip tightened on the plastic remote control. Audrey, she warned, her tone sharp and defensive. I told you to apologize. Where are you going? I did not answer her. I stopped walking when I reached the head table, positioning myself directly between Vivian and the glowing 10-foot projector screen. I stood mere feet away from Harper and Trent. The golden child shrank back slightly in her chair, unnerved by my proximity and the sheer lack of emotion on my face. Trent dropped his hands from the table, his arrogant posture stiffening into wary defensive tension. I reached into the pocket of my dress and extracted my smartphone. The glass screen caught the ambient light of the chandelier. "You want to talk about personal responsibility, Trent?" I said. My voice was level, projecting clearly across the silent room. I kept my tone entirely devoid of anger or sorrow. "You want to talk about taking accountability for financial drain?" I unlocked my device. My thumb moved across the slick interface, swiping down to open the quick settings menu. The Malibu estate featured a state-of-the-art smart home integration system. It was an expensive, highly responsive network designed for convenience, allowing seamless media sharing across the various entertainment zones. Because Vivian prioritized aesthetics over digital security, the audiovisual network was entirely unprotected. Since we are conducting financial audits on Thanksgiving, I announced to the room, keeping my eyes locked on Vivian. "We should probably look at my books, too." I tapped the Bluetooth casting icon on my screen. A list of available devices populated instantly. I selected the primary dining room projector. Vivian realized what was happening a fraction of a second too late. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Put that phone away. Turn it off." She frantically pressed buttons on her plastic remote, attempting to assert dominance over the hardware, but my smartphone had already established a direct override. Modern casting protocols prioritize the newest wireless handshake. Her physical remote was instantly rendered obsolete. A crisp electronic chime echoed from the ceiling-mounted speakers, signaling a successful pairing. The harsh white light of the projector flickered. Vivian's fabricated itemized invoice vanished from the 10-foot canvas above the marble fireplace. The bold letters declaring the cost of my existence evaporated into the digital ether. The screen went dark for one tense, suspended heartbeat. Then the projection re-illuminated. My smartphone interface was now mirrored across the massive canvas in high definition. The background was a stark, featureless gray. In the direct center of the screen sat a single encrypted file folder. The text beneath the icon was enlarged impossible for anyone in the room to misread. The folder was named Reconciliation. A dense, suffocating quiet settled over the china plates and crystal glasses. The relatives stared at the wall, their collective confusion transforming into a creeping, undefined dread. They had been invited to witness a public shaming, but the sudden technological pivot signaled a dramatic shift in the power dynamic. The scapegoat was no longer following the script. Vivian stared at the glowing folder, the color draining rapidly from her cheeks. The emerald suit seemed to hang loosely on her frame. She looked at the device in my hand, then back up at the wall, her mind racing to comprehend the threat. I kept my thumb hovering over the screen, feeling the steady rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat. For 3 years, I had gathered the fragments of her deception, compiling a ledger built on immutable facts. The folder contained the exact coordinates of her impending ruin. I did not need to shout. I did not need to cry. I only needed to open the first document and let the receipts speak for themselves. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed down the length of the dining table. The sudden appearance of my digital file overrode the carefully orchestrated narrative Vivian had spent weeks preparing. The polished, emerald-clad matriarch standing by the marble fireplace shattered. Her Southern Belle facade dissolved, revealing the raw, frantic desperation of a cornered predator. The smug satisfaction vanished from her eyes, replaced by a wide, feral panic. "Unplug it!" Vivian shrieked. The sudden volume of her voice startled the relative sitting nearest to the front. She turned her furious gaze toward her son-in-law. "Trent, pull the cord right now. Get it off the wall." Trent scrambled upright, his cashmere blazer catching on the edge of the carved wooden chair. He lunged toward the power outlet located near the baseboards, his previous arrogance entirely erased by the sudden threat of exposure. But pulling a physical cord takes time. Digital commands require only a fraction of a second. I kept my eyes fixed on the 10-foot canvas and tapped the center of my smartphone glass. The reconciliation folder opened, revealing dozens of scanned PDF files organized by date and banking institution. I selected the top document. The projector chimed again, displaying a commercial bank statement in high definition. The stark black and white financial ledger dominated the room, casting a cool glow over the horrified faces of my extended family. The bold letterhead belonged to a premier national lender. Beneath the corporate logo, the document detailed the approval of a home equity line of credit. The primary applicant name listed on the first page was Audrey Walker. "For the last 3 years," I began, my voice cutting through the rising chaos of the dining room. I pitched my tone to mirror the clinical detached delivery I use during corporate board meetings. "I have spent my evenings fielding phone calls from aggressive collection agencies regarding delinquent accounts I never opened." Trent froze halfway to the wall outlet. The gravity of the projected document paralyzed him. He understood financial paperwork. He recognized a federal banking ledger, and he knew instantly that ripping a plug from the wall would not erase the data stored on my device. He slowly straightened up, his hands dropping to his sides in defeat. I stepped closer to the projection, gesturing toward the date stamped at the top of the loan agreement. "Look at the origination date," I instructed the silent room. "This equity line was opened 10 years ago. At that specific time, I was a 20-year-old college student. I lived in a cramped university dormitory with a roommate. My net worth consisted of a used laptop, a stack of finance textbooks, and whatever wages I earned working consecutive double shifts at a local logistics firm." I scanned the faces of my aunts and uncles. They were wealthy individuals who understood the mechanics of real estate lending. They knew the stringent requirements for securing a 6-figure loan. "A 20-year-old college student does not own property," I stated, letting the undeniable logic settle over the room. I did not possess a single physical asset to leverage. Yet this equity line was secured utilizing my social security number and my clean financial background as the primary collateral. Vivian opened her mouth to interrupt, but her throat constricted. She emitted a dry, rasping sound, unable to formulate a coherent defense against a verified bank statement. I continued my presentation, ensuring every word landed with deliberate precision. When the collection notices first started arriving at my apartment in San Francisco, I assumed it was a clerical error, a minor bureaucratic mix-up. But the pink envelopes kept coming. The formal threats of wage garnishment followed shortly after. I paused, allowing the reality of my situation to register with the family members who had just spent the last 20 minutes judging me. In my profession as a compliance investigator, a flagged credit profile is not just an inconvenience, it is a career death sentence. You cannot audit corporate ledgers if your own financial history is under investigation for severe delinquency. The ghost debts were threatening to destroy the independent life I had spent a decade building. My Uncle Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He was the family pragmatist, a man who built his wealth on detail-oriented contracts. He adjusted his glasses, reading the text on the wall. "If your identity was stolen," Robert asked, his voice low and serious, "why didn't you go to the authorities? Why didn't you file a police report?" I shifted my attention to Robert, acknowledging the logical question. "I did go to the authorities, Uncle Robert," I replied. "I compiled the collection notices and walked into a local precinct. I sat down with a detective and laid out the paperwork. But the justice system has a glaring blind spot when it comes to financial crimes originating from inside a shared bloodline." I tapped my phone screen, highlighting a specific section of the projected document. A yellow box appeared around the residential address listed on the loan application. "The police looked at the origination files," I explained. "They noted that the fraudulent loans were secured using the exact street address of this Malibu estate, my childhood home. Because the paperwork originated from a family residence, law enforcement labeled the theft a domestic civil dispute. They told me it was a messy family matter outside their immediate jurisdiction and advised me to sort it out at home." I turned my head, locking my gaze onto Vivian. She shrank back against the marble fireplace, her posture crumbling under the weight of the spotlight. "So," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, resonant register, "I decided to follow their advice. I brought the dispute home." The dining room remained dead silent. The clinking of silverware, the rustle of silk, the quiet breathing of 35 relatives, everything ceased. They were watching the systematic dismantling of a matriarch. "Since the police refused to intervene," I told the room, pacing slowly in front of the illuminated canvas, "I treated my own life like a corporate audit. I utilized my own salary. I hired independent forensic accountants and digital trace experts. I paid them out of my own pocket to track every single digital footprint attached to these ghost loans. I wanted to know exactly how a physical financial instrument requiring stringent verification was approved without me ever stepping foot inside a bank branch." I stopped pacing and returned my focus to the 10-foot screen. With a swift motion of my thumb, I scrolled down to the final page of the bank statement, bringing the summary ledger into view. I pointed to the principal loan amount, bolded at the bottom of the column. "An hour ago," I said, addressing the entire extended family, "my mother presented you with a fabricated invoice. She stood up here and demanded that you pity her. She claimed she spent her retirement savings bailing me out of fictional rehabilitation centers and clearing imaginary credit card debt." I let the tension stretch, pulling the invisible thread tight before snapping it. "She told you the cost of raising a disappointment was exactly $750,000. I tapped the screen once more, drawing a bright red digital circle around the principal balance on the bank ledger. The numbers matched perfectly. 750,000. That invoice was not a bill, I declared, my words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was a confession. My mother did not spend that money on me. That is the exact sum of money she illegally borrowed in my name." The relatives gasped again, but this time the sound carried a different weight. It was no longer the sound of high society scandal. It was the visceral shock of witnessing a documented federal crime. The narrative Vivian had meticulously constructed over decades collapsed into dust. She was not a tragic, long-suffering mother shielding a delinquent child. She was a financial predator who had cannibalized her eldest daughter to sustain an illusion. Vivian shook her head frantically. The pristine helmet of blonde hair began to fray, a few strands falling across her damp forehead. She pressed her hands flat against the wooden edge of the dining table, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly lost oxygen. "No!" Vivian choked out her voice, a desperate, ragged whisper. She looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face among the aunts and uncles. She found none. They stared back at her with undisguised horror. "It is a lie. Identity theft happens every day. Hackers steal information. Someone in another state must have compromised your files. You cannot stand there and accuse your own mother of forging bank documents." It was the ultimate predictable deflection. She sought refuge in the anonymous boogeyman of the digital age. She needed the family to believe that a faceless cybercriminal was responsible for the devastation glowing on the wall. I looked at her, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. She was clinging to the last shred of plausible deniability, unaware that I was about to sever that thread permanently. I raised my smartphone, preparing to initiate the next slide, ready to show the room exactly whose hand held the pen. I swiped my thumb across the smooth glass of my smartphone. The high-definition projection shifted instantly, replacing the commercial bank ledger with a stark split-screen graphic. On the left side of the digital canvas, I displayed a magnified high-resolution scan of my California driver license. I directed the attention of the room to the signature block located at the bottom of the identification card. My handwriting is notoriously utilitarian. Being left-handed, I pushed the pen across the paper rather than pulling it, creating a sharp, jagged scrawl. It is a messy, hurried combination of print and cursive, a direct byproduct of signing endless compliance reports under tight corporate deadlines. It lacks any artistic flair or symmetry. On the right side of the split screen sat the final authorization page of the home equity loan agreement. The signature securing the six-figure debt was magnified in thick black ink. The visual contrast was jarring. The ink on the banking document flowed in elegant, sweeping loops. It was a flawless, right-handed cursive script characterized by a deliberate slant and practiced symmetry. It was the distinct penmanship of a woman who had spent her formative years attending exclusive finishing schools, learning how to sign country club checks and charity gala invitations with effortless, practiced grace. "That is not my signature," I stated, letting the undeniable visual evidence settle over the long dining table. "It does not even attempt to mimic my natural cadence." I turned my attention away from the screen and focused on the older generation seated near the front of the room. When I discovered this discrepancy, I did not rely on my own visual assessment. I operate in a professional environment that demands empirical proof. I retained a board-certified forensic document examiner. The expert spent 2 weeks analyzing the pressure points, the stroke velocity, the pen lifts, and the baseline alignment of both writing samples. I tapped my screen again. A certified, notarized summary report materialized beneath the side-by-side signatures, complete with the official seal of the forensic examiner. "The forensic analysis is conclusive," I explained, keeping my delivery flat, objective, and devoid of emotional inflection. "The individual who signed the federal loan documents is definitively right-handed. They utilized a heavy, deliberate downward stroke entirely inconsistent with my specific biomechanics." The expert swore under penalty of perjury that these two signatures were authored by two distinct individuals. The gravity of the situation transformed the atmosphere of the dining room. The lingering holiday tension evaporated, replaced by the chilling, suffocating reality of criminal liability. We were no longer navigating a toxic mother-daughter dispute over a catered turkey dinner. We had crossed a definitive threshold into the realm of federal felonies. Identity theft and wire fraud on this scale carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Uncle Robert sat rigid in his carved mahogany chair. As a man who managed a sprawling portfolio of commercial real estate contracts, Robert examined binding signatures every single day of his life. He understood the profound legal weight of a forensic handwriting report. He stared at the looping, elegant letter A on the right side of the screen. His eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Robert had received birthday cards, holiday letters, and formal invitations from Vivian for the past 3 decades. He recognized the distinct looping curvature of the ink. The horror dawning on his face was palpable. He slowly turned his head away from the wall and stared directly at his sister, his jaw clamped tightly shut. Vivian intercepted his stare. The pristine facade she had maintained for 30 years cracked wide open. The polished Malibu socialite vanished, leaving behind a frantic cornered woman trying desperately to plug the holes in a sinking ship. She realized the forensic evidence was stripping away her deniability, so she executed a rapid, calculated pivot. She attempted to rally the room through pure, unadulterated emotional manipulation. "This proves nothing," Vivian announced. Her voice trembled, pitching higher as she tried to project an aura of wounded innocence. She stepped away from the marble fireplace, moving closer to the long oak table. She reached out with both hands, palms turned upward, pleading her case to the jury of our relatives. "Data breaches happen every single day," she insisted, scanning the faces of her siblings and cousins. "Hackers steal financial profiles from major corporations. Criminal syndicates buy social security numbers on the dark web. Some faceless cyber criminal in another state must have harvested your information, Audrey. They fabricated the documents. They forged the signatures using an automated machine. You watch the news. You know how sophisticated these thieves are today." She pressed a hand to her chest, right over her heart, summoning a fresh wave of artificial tears. She had mastered the art of playing the victim long before I was ever born. "How could you stand there and accuse me?" Vivian wept, letting her voice break perfectly on the final syllable. "I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you in this beautiful home. You think I would commit a federal crime to ruin my own flesh and blood? You think a mother would ever forge banking documents to destroy her own child?" It was a desperate, calculated gamble. Vivian was betting her entire survival on the family's inherent cowardice. Wealthy society operates on a strict code of willful ignorance. They despise public scandal. They prefer a neat, comfortable lie over a messy, horrifying truth. A faceless cybercriminal was a convenient villain. An international syndicate was a problem they could discuss with sympathy over cocktails at the country club. A mother cannibalizing her eldest daughter was an abomination they simply did not want to acknowledge. The cognitive dissonance took hold of the room. I watched the psychological shift ripple down the length of the table. Aunt Patricia, sitting near the center, clutched her pearl necklace and let out a soft, trembling sigh. She looked at the glowing screen, then at Vivian's weeping face. Patricia nodded slowly, her expression softening with relief. "Vivian is right," Patricia murmured, her voice carrying a fragile hope. "Identity theft is a global crisis. Those criminals are highly sophisticated. They can fabricate anything from a computer screen." Another aunt chimed in, eager to grasp the lifeline Vivian had thrown into the center of the room. "It makes total sense. A professional hacker would have the digital tools to fake a signature. Vivian would never know how to bypass bank security protocols. She does not even know how to reset her own email password." The murmurs of agreement began to multiply. The relatives were actively choosing the delusion. They were willing to dismiss the certified forensic analysis because accepting the truth meant acknowledging the monster standing in their dining room. They wanted to pack the scandal into a neat little box, blame the internet, and return to their imported champagne before Grandma Beatrice ever caught wind of the disturbance. Harper seized the shifting momentum. The golden child sat up straighter, a triumphant gleam returning to her eyes. She brushed a strand of hair over her shoulder, feeling the threat to her unearned lifestyle recede. "You are just being paranoid," Audrey Harper said, her tone dripping with renewed condescension. "You are embarrassing yourself and trying to ruin Thanksgiving because you got scammed online. You should be apologizing to Mom for putting her through this terrible stress. You owe her an apology right now." Trent nodded in agreement, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh of relief. The tech incubator executive believed the storm had passed. He believed the wealthy enclave of the Walker family had successfully insulated itself from the facts. He shot me a warning glare, silently demanding that I shut down the projector and accept the narrative the family had chosen to adopt. I did not interrupt their shared delusion. I stood quietly near the head table, listening to the chorus of aunts and cousins validate my mother's fabricated defense. I watched Vivian wipe away her tears, her posture straightening as she felt the power dynamic swinging back in her favor. She offered me a look of profound, pitying forgiveness, utilizing the ultimate weapon in her narcissistic arsenal. They wanted a faceless cybercriminal. They wanted a convenient scapegoat across the globe to absorb the blame for the devastation glowing on the wall. They believed the firewall of their social standing could repel the empirical data stored on my device. I felt the cool, smooth glass of my smartphone beneath my thumb. I knew the precise nature of the evidence waiting in the next slide. A global hacker was a comforting theory, but a global hacker leaves a very specific digital trail. I knew that the defense they were so desperately clinging to was about to shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. The dining room buzzed with the collective relief of a wealthy family clutching at a convenient fiction. Aunt Patricia was already adjusting her posture, ready to sweep the unpleasantness under a metaphorical rug. The scent of roasted turkey and expensive sage stuffing suddenly felt heavy and cloying in the stagnant air. I did not raise my voice to cut through their nervous chatter. In my line of work, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the weakest defense. I let the murmurs peak before I stepped directly into the center of the projector beam. A faceless hacker in another country does not know the name of the golden retriever we had when I was 6, I stated. My voice carried a sharp, unyielding edge that instantly silenced the room. An international cyber syndicate operating out of a basement across the globe does not know my favorite elementary school teacher. They do not know the maiden name of my paternal grandmother. And they certainly do not use the exact street address of this Malibu estate to bypass a premier banking institution's secondary security questions. During my early 20s, I spent my holidays far away from this coastline working overtime shifts to build my savings and establish my financial independence. Vivian used my absence to her advantage. She had unfettered access to my discarded childhood documents, old tax forms, and expired passports stored in the attic boxes. She weaponized my personal history to construct an airtight profile for the lenders. A stranger could never replicate the intimate details required to pass a thorough identity verification process for a 6-figure credit line. I tapped the glass of my smartphone. The split screen vanished. In its place, a dense spreadsheet of alphanumeric codes and timestamps materialized on the wall. These are Internet Protocol logs, I explained to the silent audience. When the local police refused to file a report, I retained a private digital forensics firm. They legally subpoenaed the internet service provider linked to the fraudulent applications. I traced a finger along the projected rows of data. A digital footprint is permanent. Every single keystroke leaves a trail. The electronic loan applications were not filed from an overseas server. They were filed from the primary wireless router sitting right here in the Malibu living room on a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting at my desk 300 miles away in San Francisco. Aunt Patricia dropped her hands into her lap. The pearl necklace she had been clutching slipped from her fingers, clattering softly against her porcelain dinner plate. The comfortable illusion of the global hacker disintegrated, leaving nothing but the cold, undeniable truth of domestic betrayal. But committing wire fraud requires more than just an internet connection. I continued pacing slowly in front of the table. It requires authorized signatures. It requires notarization to secure the property liens. Vivian was a creature of habit. She navigated high society through a network of favors, assuming the strict rules of formal finance operated on the same principle as securing a reservation at an exclusive restaurant. She believed her social capital shielded her from scrutiny, operating under the delusion that federal laws did not apply to her specific tax bracket. I swiped the screen again. The IP logs disappeared, replaced by a high-resolution screenshot of an email inbox. The sender address belonged to Vivian. The recipient was a woman named Madeline, a local country club acquaintance who served on the neighborhood homeowner association board and conveniently held a state notary commission. "You all know Madeline," I said, casting a glance over the stunned faces of my aunts. "You play tennis with her on Tuesday mornings. She takes her notary seal very lightly." I read the projected text aloud, ensuring the exact phrasing echoed off the dining room walls. "Madeline, darling, I need a tiny favor. Audrey is out of town for work, and I have these bank documents that require an urgent stamp before the interest rate lock expires tomorrow. If you could just press your seal on the signature pages, I will sign her name later and drop off those VIP charity gala tickets we discussed. The email was dated the exact same week the home equity line of credit was finalized. The timestamp matched the IP logs perfectly. The undeniable receipts of federal wire fraud and identity theft glowed in 10-foot letters on the wall above the marble fireplace. I turned to look at my mother. Vivian looked physically ill. Her pristine emerald suit tailored to project wealth and authority suddenly resembled a prison uniform. The color had drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a chalky, artificial mask. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles white, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. Her meticulously constructed reality had collapsed in the span of 3 minutes. She had no defense. The concrete proof of a felony was staring back at her. The reactions of the relatives were profound. The same people who had offered her deep abiding pity mere minutes ago now recoiled. The social hierarchy of the Walker family was ruthless. They could forgive a bad investment. They could excuse a tasteless remark. But forging bank documents to steal from your own child, bartering charity tickets for a felony, was a permanent stain. Uncle Robert stared at his sister with unfiltered revulsion. He shifted his chair backward instinctively, creating physical distance between himself and a convicted fraudster. Harper sat frozen in her chair, the triumphant smirk wiped entirely from her features. She looked at the email, then at our mother, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of the crime. Trent looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. He refused to look at the screen, keeping his eyes fixed on his porcelain dinner plate, mentally calculating his own exposure to the impending legal fallout. "You thought you could stand here today and brand me a failure?" I said, my voice quiet, but carrying tremendous weight. "You thought you could present a fabricated invoice to this family and walk away as the tragic victim. You wanted them to believe I was a parasite." Vivian opened her mouth, a weak, trembling sound escaping her throat. "Audrey, please. You do not get to ask for favors," I replied, cutting her off instantly. I turned my back to her, facing the stunned audience. The destruction of my mother's reputation was not the final objective. It was merely the necessary foundation for the real audit. "We have established the mechanism of the theft," I told the paralyzed room. "We know exactly how the documents were forged. We know exactly who pressed the notary seal. We have established that my mother committed a federal crime to secure a staggering amount of liquid capital." I let the silence stretch, holding the attention of every single person at the table. "But securing the funds is only the first phase of an embezzlement scheme," I continued. $750,000 does not simply vanish into thin air. It does not sit idle in a checking account. A sum of that magnitude requires a destination. It requires a purpose. I looked directly at Trent. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck tightening visibly above his cashmere collar. He knew the parameters of a financial audit. He knew that routing numbers always leave a definitive trail. I raised my smartphone, my thumb hovering over the screen, preparing to initiate the next phase of the presentation. A forged signature explains how the money was stolen. I announced, my tone razor sharp. Now we are going to look at exactly where it went. The amber glow of the crystal chandeliers felt heavy, casting long shadows across the catered turkey and untouched side dishes. I stepped away from the head table, creating physical distance between myself and the panicked woman standing by the fireplace. I needed the audience to focus entirely on the data, severing their emotional attachment to Vivian and directing their attention to the mechanics of her crime. "A forged signature explains the methodology of the theft," I announced. My voice remained steady, a calm anchor in the center of a rising storm. "It answers the question of how my mother bypassed the strict verification protocols of a premier banking institution. But securing a line of credit is only the initial step of financial fraud. Capital does not simply vanish into the ether. $750,000 carries a heavy digital footprint. It demands a destination." I swiped my thumb across the glass of my smartphone. The projector chimed, erasing the incriminating email from the wall. A new document materialized on the 10-foot canvas. It was a complex, multi-columned grid filled with dates, routing numbers, and transaction amounts. These are federal wire transfer logs, I explained, gesturing toward the bright screen. I acquired them during my private forensic investigation. Let us revisit the fabricated invoice my mother presented at the beginning of this dinner. She stood before you and claimed she spent $250,000 on a luxury rehabilitation clinic. She claimed she spent an additional $100,000 eradicating my emergency credit card debt. I pointed to the top rows of the projected spreadsheet tracing the flow of numbers. If you trace the outflow of capital from the illicit home equity line, you will notice a glaring absence, I stated. $0 were routed to any medical facility. $0 were transferred to any credit card issuing bank. The narrative of my supposed delinquency was nothing more than a convenient fiction designed specifically to obscure the actual trajectory of the stolen funds. I walked slowly along the edge of the dining table. Uncle Robert was leaning forward, his eyes scanning the dense rows of routing numbers with the intense scrutiny of a seasoned real estate investor. Aunt Patricia watched me with rapt attention, her prior loyalty to Vivian entirely superseded by the undeniable evidence glowing above the marble fireplace. The room was no longer filled with sympathetic relatives. It was filled with horrified witnesses. Amateur embezzlers often make the same fundamental mistake. I informed the room, slipping effortlessly into the cadence of a corporate compliance seminar. They believe that moving stolen assets through multiple international jurisdictions renders the money invisible. They rely on outdated cinematic tropes, assuming that crossing a border somehow erases the ledger. But modern banking is an interconnected global network, and every single transaction leaves an immutable receipt. I tapped my screen to highlight 3 specific outgoing wire transfers. The rows illuminated in bright blue. My mother did not keep the cash in her personal accounts, I continued. The day after the loan funded the capital was dispersed into 3 separate international holding accounts located in the Cayman Islands. A low murmur rippled through the seated relatives. The mention of offshore banking elevated the scandal from a domestic dispute to a sophisticated financial conspiracy. Vivian remained frozen near the wall, her hands trembling at her sides, realizing the depths of my investigation. She had assumed her digital tracks were covered by geographical distance. She had severely underestimated the capabilities of a dedicated investigator armed with the right subpoenas. The Cayman accounts functioned as a temporary digital smokescreen, I explained, maintaining my objective tone. It is a classic layering technique designed to confuse amateur auditors and stall routine investigations. The funds sat in those offshore accounts for exactly 14 days. They were then consolidated, bundled into a single outbound wire transfer, and routed right back to the United States. I swiped my screen again. The complex web of international routing numbers dissolved, replaced by a straightforward domestic deposit record. The money returned to a banking institution located in Delaware, I said. Delaware is famous for its corporate privacy laws, making it the preferred destination for individuals seeking to hide ownership of assets. The entirety of the $750,000 was deposited into the business checking account of a single newly formed corporate entity. I highlighted the name of the recipient organization on the wall. The text glowed bright yellow against the white background. The final destination of the stolen inheritance was a shell company, I announced. An organization existing only on paper, lacking any physical storefront employees or legitimate revenue streams. The name of that shell company is Apex Innovation Solutions. I let the name hang in the silent air. I turned my head, shifting my focus from the projector screen to the head table. Harper sat rigid in her chair, her custom silk gown losing its luster as the reality of the situation closed in around her. Beside her, Trent was staring at the wall, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face ticked with visible tension. Trent had spent the past 5 years curating the persona of a visionary tech founder. He wore expensive cashmere blazers, attended high-profile industry conferences, and spoke endlessly about venture capital and disruptive technology. He presented himself as a self-made titan of Silicon Valley, condescending to anyone who worked a traditional job. He had loudly advised me to take responsibility for my life mere minutes ago, projecting an aura of pristine corporate success. A shell company is designed to shield the identity of its true owner, I explained to my aunts and uncles, keeping my eyes locked on Trent. But the corporate veil is not impenetrable. When you file formation documents with the Secretary of State, you are legally required to list a managing member. Even if you use a registered agent to obscure the initial paperwork, a forensic subpoena can compel the disclosure of the actual beneficiary. I raised my smartphone one final time for this phase of the audit. I pressed my thumb against the glass. The wall display shifted, revealing a scanned copy of a formal government registration document. It was the official certificate of formation from the Delaware Division of Corporations. I had digitally applied a bright yellow highlighter across the section labeled Managing Member. The stolen funds did not go to a drug rehab, I stated, my voice ringing with finality. They went directly to the managing member of Apex Innovation Solutions. The name glowing inside the yellow box was Trent Alexander Vance. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The dining room seemed to hold its collective breath, the air thick with impending realization. Then came a sharp, piercing crack. Trent dropped his heavy silver fork. It struck his porcelain dinner plate, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vaulted space. The fork bounced off the table and clattered onto the hardwood floor. Trent did not reach down to retrieve it. His hands were paralyzed, hovering above the white linen tablecloth. The arrogant smirk that usually defined his features was eradicated. The confident posture of the tech incubator chief executive collapsed in real time. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly, pale gray pallor. The tailored cashmere blazer suddenly looked like a costume draped over a terrified man. He stared at his own name projected in 10-foot letters, recognizing the undeniable proof of his complicity. He understood federal tax codes, and he knew that receiving stolen funds across state lines constituted multiple federal offenses. The 35 relatives sitting along the oak table turned in unison. Every single head pivoted away from the marble fireplace and fixed their gaze on the golden child and her husband. The realization hit the family like a physical shockwave. Vivian had not stolen the money to fund her own lavish lifestyle. She had committed identity theft, risked prison sentences, and publicly humiliated her eldest daughter solely to funnel $750,000 into the pockets of her son-in-law. Uncle Robert gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. His initial disgust toward Vivian morphed into a targeted, furious glare directed at Trent. Aunt Patricia covered her mouth with her hand, suppressing a gasp. The narrative of the tragic matriarch and the delinquent daughter was dead, replaced by the horrifying truth of a vast coordinated extortion scheme operating right under their noses. Harper looked at the screen, then turned to her husband. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow and rapid. She had spent her entire adult life basking in the unearned luxury provided by Vivian, never questioning the source of the capital. She believed her husband was a financial genius. Now the foundation of her $2.5 million La Jolla mansion was revealed to be a crime scene. But exposing the destination of the money was only part of the equation. Finding a hidden bank account answers the question of where the capital landed, but it does not answer the fundamental question of why. I watched Trent tremble in his chair, knowing the tech incubator he boasted about was nothing more than a fragile facade. The relatives were staring at him with mounting fury, unaware that his failing business ventures were merely the outer layer of a much deeper, darker betrayal. The paralyzing silence broke with a sudden, sharp shriek. Harper lunged forward in her carved oak chair. Her abrupt movement knocked over her crystal wineglass. The fragile stem snapped against the polished table edge. A dark red pool of Cabernet Sauvignon spilled across the crisp white linen tablecloth. The liquid spread rapidly, soaking into the pristine fabric, like a spreading wound, a visual manifestation of the stain rapidly expanding across her carefully curated reputation. Harper ignored the shattered glass. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The golden child was watching her unearned empire crumble, and she reverted to the only defensive strategy she had ever known. "This is a setup!" Harper screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing harshly off the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "You fabricated those documents. You hacked into the projector and faked those bank records because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of my marriage and my success." Harper looked around the dining room, frantically seeking validation from the aunts and uncles who had always catered to her every whim. She begged them to ignore the glowing screen above the marble fireplace. She insisted that I was a bitter, resentful spinster trying to ruin a beautiful Thanksgiving dinner with lies. It was a textbook psychological deflection, a mirror image of the tactics our mother had utilized mere minutes ago. Harper possessed an entire identity built upon external validation and aesthetic perfection. Her $2.5 million La Jolla mansion, her luxury vehicles, and her status in the elite social circles were the foundation of her self-worth. If her husband was exposed as a corporate fraud, she would become an object of high society pity, which in her world constituted a fate far worse than death. I did not raise my voice to counter her hysterical accusations. I maintained my clinical posture, allowing her shrill desperation to highlight the contrast between her panic and my objective calm. I waited for her to run out of breath. When her screaming subsided into ragged, uneven pants, I tapped the glass of my smartphone one more time. "I did not fabricate a Delaware state seal," Harper, I stated smoothly. "My forensic investigators acquired those incorporation records through legal public channels. But if you dispute the ownership of the shell company, perhaps you will recognize these documents." The projector chimed. The corporate registration files vanished. In their place, a cascade of severe legal notices filled the 10-foot canvas. The letterheads belonged to the San Diego County Superior Court and various commercial property management firms. They were stamped in bright red ink, bearing urgent legal deadlines. I directed the attention of the horrified relatives to the specific dates on the projected documents. "These are commercial lease default notices," I explained to the room. "Alongside them are formal demands for payment from unpaid software developers and hardware vendors, and right here in the center is a preliminary warning of impending bankruptcy filed by primary creditors." I highlighted the timestamps located in the upper right corner of the court filings. Every single one of these legal threats was issued exactly 3 weeks before our mother forged my signature on that home equity line of credit. I turned my gaze back to my sister. The smug superiority she had worn at the beginning of the dinner was entirely eradicated. "Trent is not a tech industry visionary," I told her, ensuring my words carried to the furthest corners of the long table. "He is a catastrophic financial failure. His tech incubator produced 0 viable software. He signed a lease for 20,000 square feet of premium commercial real estate simply to project an aura of success while secretly drowning in an ocean of unpaid debt. He was 6 months behind on rent. Creditors were preparing to seize his business assets and place a lien on your beautiful oceanfront home." The truth landed like a physical blow. Vivian did not steal my identity because she needed extra cash to purchase designer shoes or fund a European vacation. She committed federal wire fraud to secretly bail out a failing son-in-law. She funneled $750,000 into Trent and his shell company to keep the creditors at bay, ensuring that the golden child never had to face the indignity of a foreclosure. Vivian destroyed my credit score to guarantee that Harper and her Instagram-perfect lifestyle never missed a single beat. The realization crashed down upon Harper. Her legs gave out. She collapsed backward into her chair, the fight draining from her body. She looked down at her custom silk gown. She thought about her luxury sports car parked in the sprawling driveway outside. She thought about the infinity pool overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Every single piece of her flawless aesthetic was the direct proceed of a felony committed against her own sister. Harper covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook as she began to sob. These were not the practiced theatrical tears her mother employed to garner sympathy. These were genuine, ugly, ragged gasps of a woman whose entire reality had just been obliterated. She turned toward Trent, reaching a trembling hand out to her husband, seeking some form of comfort or denial. Trent did not return her gesture. He did not reach out to hold his weeping wife. He sat rigid, his eyes locked on his porcelain dinner plate, ignoring her entirely. His mind was engaged in a grim, frantic calculus regarding the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was a cornered man realizing the federal trap had snapped shut around his ankles. Comforting his spouse was irrelevant when he was staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. The 35 relatives watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. They were witnessing the total structural collapse of the Golden Child Empire. The pedestal Vivian had meticulously constructed for Harper was reduced to rubble. The hierarchy of the Walker family, maintained through decades of manipulation and favoritism, was irreversibly inverted right before their eyes. Uncle Robert shook his head, a gesture of profound disgust, directed at the crumbling couple at the head table. Aunt Patricia looked away, unable to stomach the sight of the ruined golden child. But my audit was not yet complete. Proving the destination of the stolen funds exposed the lie, but it left a glaring logical inconsistency hovering in the stagnant dining room air. I paced back to the center of the projector beam, preparing to guide the jury toward the darkest corner of the conspiracy. Securing a fraudulent loan of this magnitude is a colossal risk, I announced to the silent audience. My mother owns a sprawling oceanfront estate. She possesses substantial investment portfolios and pristine personal credit. If her son-in-law was facing bankruptcy, she possessed the liquid assets and the collateral to rescue him legally. I paused, letting the relatives process the discrepancy. I looked at Vivian, who was still trembling by the marble fireplace, her eyes wide with mounting terror as she realized where my presentation was heading. She could have walked into any premier banking institution in California and secured a legitimate commercial loan in her own name within an hour, I continued. There was no financial need to forge my signature. There was no logistical reason to risk federal wire fraud and a mandatory minimum prison sentence just to save Trent from his creditors. Unless, of course, the bailout was not a voluntary act of maternal generosity. I raised my smartphone, holding the device steady in my right hand. The relatives leaned forward, captivated by the escalating tension. The air in the room grew dense, thick with the anticipation of a secret far more devastating than a simple financial crime. "You did not steal my identity out of convenience, Mom," I said quietly. "You stole my legitimate inheritance and hijacked my clean credit score because Trent was not just asking for a bailout. Trent was demanding a ransom." The word ransom hung in the stagnant air of the dining room. It was a heavy, dangerous accusation that shifted the entire paradigm of the evening. Embezzlement is a crime driven by greed. Extortion is a crime driven by leverage. I maintained my position at the head of the table, letting the severe implications of that single word settle over the 35 relatives. I looked at my mother. Vivian possessed a sprawling oceanfront estate, a property valued well into the 8 figures. She managed a robust portfolio of municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks inherited from her side of the family. Her personal credit rating was flawless. If her beloved son-in-law truly required an infusion of capital to salvage his failing tech incubator, she held every legal mechanism necessary to provide it. She could have liquidated assets. She could have secured a conventional commercial mortgage. Instead, she chose to bypass her own pristine financial resources. She chose to commit federal wire fraud, forging the signature of her 20-year-old daughter. That specific choice defied basic economic logic unless her own money was somehow restricted or the demand for cash was so urgent and illicit that it required a shadow transaction. I turned my focus back to Trent. He sat frozen in his carved oak chair, his hands gripping the edge of the crisp white tablecloth. The arrogant posture he had carried into this house was gone. He looked like a cornered animal, recognizing the walls closing in around him. Trent did not approach my mother requesting a simple family loan. I explained to the silent room, keeping my voice steady and resonant. He did not bring a comprehensive business plan or a structured repayment schedule. He brought a threat. He uncovered a piece of information so toxic, so uniquely destructive to the Walker family hierarchy that Vivian was willing to risk a mandatory minimum prison sentence to purchase his silence. The atmosphere in the dining room grew dense, thick with the anticipation of a secret far darker than forged bank documents. Extortion is a dirty word in high society. It implies a profound loss of control. Vivian had spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable superiority, projecting the illusion that she dictated the terms of every relationship. The revelation that she had been blackmailed, manipulated, and coerced by a junior tech executive stripped away her remaining dignity. I directed my gaze toward the far end of the long dining table. My father, Richard Walker, sat perfectly still. He had not spoken a single word since the projector descended from the ceiling. Richard was a man who built his fortune in commercial real estate, relying on analytical precision and a strict code of personal loyalty. He was stoic by nature, observing the chaos with the calculating eye of a man assessing a structural collapse. For decades, he had tolerated Vivian and her theatrical outbursts, assuming her flaws were limited to vanity and favoritism. He had no idea that his wife had compromised his eldest daughter to pay a ransom. Vivian tracked my line of sight. When she saw me looking at Richard, a fresh wave of panic washed over her features. Her chest heaved, the emerald fabric of her tailored suit wrinkling as she struggled to draw oxygen. The fear radiating from her was palpable. She was terrified of the law, but she was entirely consumed by her fear of the quiet man sitting at the opposite end of the room. Trent recognized the shifting dynamic. He understood the precarious nature of his position. He was a fraudster surrounded by wealthy, influential individuals who now viewed him as a parasite. He knew that federal extortion carried a far heavier legal penalty than simple corporate bankruptcy. His survival instincts finally overrode his paralysis. "This is an absurd witch hunt," Trent announced, his voice cracking on the final syllable. He pushed his chair backward, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the polished floorboards. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his cashmere blazer with trembling hands, attempting to project an aura of offended dignity. "I will not sit here and be slandered by a resentful woman trying to ruin a holiday dinner." He did not look at Harper, who was still weeping silently beside him. He did not look at Vivian, the woman he had extorted for $750,000. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany double doors located at the back of the dining room. "I am leaving," Trent declared, stepping away from the table. "My legal counsel will handle these ridiculous allegations in the morning. Do not contact me." He took 3 brisk steps toward the exit, desperate to escape the physical confines of the estate before the final piece of evidence could be displayed. He needed to reach his luxury sports car, sever his ties to the crumbling Walker dynasty, and outrun the impending federal subpoenas. He did not make it to the doors. Uncle Robert rose from his seat. The sudden movement caught the attention of every relative in the room. Robert was Richard's younger brother, a man who shared the same sharp analytical features and the same deep-seated intolerance for deception. He had spent the last hour processing the undeniable proof of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The revelation that his sister-in-law had targeted her own daughter was vile, but the discovery that an outsider had orchestrated the extortion scheme ignited a fierce protective fury. Robert crossed the dining room with long, purposeful strides. He reached the back of the hall before Trent could grasp the brass door handles. Robert turned, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, effectively barricading the only exit. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression hard and unyielding. "Sit back down," Robert commanded. His voice did not carry the theatrical volume Vivian used. It was a low, dangerous rumble that demanded immediate compliance. Trent stopped in his tracks, standing mere feet away from the older man. The tech executive puffed out his chest, attempting to utilize his height advantage. "You cannot hold me here against my will," Trent stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the heavy doors. "Move out of my way, Robert, or I will involve the police." "I think involving the police is an excellent idea," Robert replied, his tone laced with icy contempt. "I am sure the authorities would be highly interested in discussing the Delaware shell company registered under your name. I am sure they would love to review the federal wire transfer logs currently projected on that wall." Trent faltered, his bluff called instantly. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but the 35 relatives stared back at him with unified hostility. The wealthy enclave of the Walker family had closed its ranks. They despised public scandal, but they possessed a ruthless instinct for self-preservation. Trent was no longer considered a member of the family. He was a hostile threat, an extortionist who had infiltrated their inner circle and siphoned their wealth. "You are not walking out of this house until we hear the rest of the presentation," Robert stated, maintaining his position in front of the mahogany doors. "You demanded a ransom from my sister-in-law. You funded your failing business with stolen capital. You are going to sit in that chair and listen to every single word Audrey has to say." Trent looked at the imposing figure blocking his path. The bravado drained entirely from his posture. He was a man accustomed to utilizing corporate jargon and slick presentations to navigate conflicts. He possessed no defense against the blunt, uncompromising force of a seasoned patriarch protecting his family legacy. Defeated, Trent turned around and walked slowly back to the head table. He sank into his carved oak chair, his shoulders slumped in submission. The physical trap was set. The extortionist was contained. The audience was primed, their attention fixed entirely on the 10-foot canvas glowing above the marble fireplace. I watched the exchange from the front of the room, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat. The meticulous groundwork of the audit was finished. I had established the mechanism of the theft. I had proven the destination of the funds. I had exposed the underlying motive of extortion. Only one question remained unanswered in the stagnant air of the dining room. I looked down at the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. The final document was waiting in the digital queue. It was an intercepted communication, an encrypted file I had discovered buried in the depths of a compromised cloud server. It was the piece of leverage Trent had used to extort $750,000 from a Malibu socialite. It was the darkest, most destructive secret the Walker family had ever harbored, and I was about to drag it into the light. The sharp thud of bone-striking hardwood echoed through the dining room. Vivian collapsed. Her knees hit the polished oak floorboards with a heavy, ungraceful impact. The tailored emerald pantsuit, a garment chosen specifically to project unassailable authority, bunched and wrinkled around her waist. She slumped forward, bracing her hands against the floor. Her pristine helmet of blonde hair finally came undone. Pale strands fell across her face, sticking to the sudden sheen of cold sweat on her forehead. Cornered predators discard logic when their survival is threatened. Vivian realized the forensic data projected on the wall constituted an impenetrable fortress. She could not argue with Internet protocol logs or Delaware corporate registrations. Stripped of her empirical defenses, she resorted to the ultimate primal weapon in her psychological arsenal. She weaponized her own perceived victimhood. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, mixing with her expensive cosmetics. Dark streaks of mascara tracked down her pale cheeks, dripping onto the crisp white collar of her silk blouse. She looked up at me from the floor, her face contorted into a mask of pure hysterical anguish. "Stop this presentation right now," Vivian screamed. Her voice tore through her throat, harsh and ragged, lacking any of the practiced Southern belle charm she had employed at the beginning of the dinner. "I am begging you to stop this. You are destroying our family." I looked down at the woman kneeling before me. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I watched her execute a performance she had rehearsed for decades. Whenever Vivian lost an argument, whenever she was confronted with her own toxic behavior, she summoned tears. She relied on the ingrained conditioning of the Walker family to rescue her. For 30 years, her weeping served as an automatic kill switch for any conflict. The moment she cried, aunts and uncles would rush to her side, offering tissues and soothing words, effectively neutralizing whoever had dared to challenge the matriarch. She waited for that rescue now. She remained on her knees, sobbing audibly, casting desperate, searching glances down the length of the long table. Nobody moved. The conditioning was broken. The 35 relatives remained frozen in their carved oak chairs. They looked at the weeping woman on the floor, and then they looked up at the 10-foot canvas glowing above the marble fireplace. The undeniable receipts of federal wire fraud outshone the theatrical tears. Uncle Robert kept his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hardening into a mask of cold judgment. Aunt Patricia averted her eyes, unable to stomach the sight of her sister groveling. The illusion of high society perfection was dead, and the audience was finally seeing the architect of the family misery in stark, unforgiving lighting. When the tears failed to summon her expected rescuers, Vivian executed a rapid, frantic pivot. The sorrow vanished from her eyes, replaced by a dark, venomous spite. If she could not manipulate the room with pity, she would attempt to manipulate me with terror. "If you do not turn that projector off, I will call the police," Vivian hissed. She raised a trembling hand, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "I will dial emergency services right now. I will tell the detectives that you orchestrated this entire scheme. I will swear under oath that you hacked my computer, stole my identity, and routed that money to Trent just to frame me. I will tell a judge you fabricated this entire audit because you are a disturbed, jealous daughter trying to ruin my life." It was a staggering display of narcissistic delusion. She genuinely believed her word held more weight than empirical data. She assumed her status as a wealthy Malibu socialite would grant her immunity in a court of law, allowing her to commit perjury and successfully frame the very person she had already victimized. She thought she could outmaneuver a certified compliance investigator with a fabricated story. I reached toward the edge of the dining table, resting my hand on the sleek leather tote bag I had carried into the estate. I unzipped the main compartment. "You cannot call the local police, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the silent room. I pulled a thick, heavy object from the tote and dropped it onto the white linen tablecloth. The object landed with a dense, authoritative thud. It was a black physical binder nearly 3 inches thick, secured with heavy-duty metal clasps and divided by dozens of brightly colored legal tabs. I reached into the tote again and produced a second identical binder, dropping it next to the first. I already handled the notifications I announced, resting my fingertips on the textured covers. Vivian stared at the binders, her chest heaving, her frantic breathing stuttering to a halt. "What are those?" she whispered. "These are the exact forensic portfolios currently projected on that wall," I explained. "Every certified handwriting analysis, every internet protocol log, every Delaware shell company registration and international wire transfer receipt. Everything is printed, bound, and notarized." I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between myself and the kneeling woman. "I did not mail them to the local police precinct." I continued, ensuring the entire table heard my next sentence. "Local detectives are notoriously unequipped to handle complex offshore embezzlement. I mailed these physical portfolios yesterday morning. I sent them directly via certified courier to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." The mention of the Federal Tax Authority sent a visible shockwave down the dining table. Wealthy individuals living in exclusive coastal enclaves operate with a certain level of disdain for local law enforcement. They view municipal police as manageable obstacles, but the Internal Revenue Service commands absolute, unfiltered terror. The Criminal Investigation Division does not negotiate. They do not care about country club memberships or social standing. They follow the ledger. They freeze assets, seize properties, and dismantle generational wealth with clinical, unstoppable efficiency. "Trent received $750,000 in stolen funds," I informed the paralyzed room. "He utilized a shell company to hide the capital, and he certainly did not declare that influx of cash on his corporate tax returns. That constitutes federal tax evasion. My mother forged banking documents to facilitate that transfer, which constitutes wire fraud and conspiracy." I looked at Trent, who was staring at the black binders as if they were explosive devices. "The federal agents are not going to care about your tears, Mom," I said. "They are going to secure search warrants for this estate. They are going to seize your computers, audit your investment portfolios, and examine every single financial transaction you have authorized for the past decade." The relatives physically recoiled. The implication of a sprawling federal audit terrified them. Anyone holding joint accounts or shared real estate ventures with Vivian realized their own finances were about to be dragged into the light. Vivian was no longer just a disgraced matriarch, she was legally radioactive. The family members shifted their chairs backward, desperate to create as much physical distance from her as possible. Vivian sagged toward the floor. The last remaining shred of her defiance evaporated. Her threat of perjury was entirely neutralized by the impending arrival of federal investigators. She had spent 30 years cultivating an empire built on appearances, and I had just handed the demolition orders to the United States government. I looked down at the ruined, weeping woman on the hardwood floor. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. The psychological chains she had wrapped around my neck since childhood were severed, lying broken on the floor beside her ruined emerald suit. "You spent my entire life treating me like a failure," I said softly. My voice was calm, devoid of any lingering resentment. I spoke the words with the clarity of a person reading an established historical fact. "You designated me as the problem child. You paraded Harper around as your crowning achievement, while you belittled my career, mocked my practical choices, and attempted to convince this entire family that I was a fundamental disappointment." Vivian looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her mascara smeared across her cheekbones. She had no retorts left. She was entirely stripped of her armor. "You did not do that because I was difficult." I continued, holding her broken gaze. "You did not do that because I was a financial burden. I have paid my own way since the day I turned 18. I let the silence hang, ensuring the final piece of the psychological puzzle resonated with the aunts and uncles sitting behind me. "You designated me as the scapegoat because I was the only person in this house you could not control," I stated. "You knew my independence made me immune to your financial manipulation. You could buy Trent, you could buy Harper, you could buy the loyalty of your country club friends, but you could never buy my silence. You needed an enemy to distract the family from your own hidden rot, and I was the most convenient target." Vivian lowered her head, her chin resting against her chest. She let out a low, defeated sob. The matriarch was conquered. The golden child was shattered. The extortionist was trapped. But the final layer of the audit remained. The federal crimes explained the method of her downfall, but they did not explain the genesis of her hatred. I had exposed the extortion, but I had not yet revealed the specific secret Trent used to leverage the money. I turned my back on my mother and faced the 10-foot projection screen. I picked up my smartphone, my thumb hovering over the interface. It was time to show the family exactly what Vivian was willing to risk federal prison to hide. I faced the 10-foot projection canvas. The digital display still showed the Delaware corporate registrations and the highlighting around Trent and his name. The dining room felt like a pressurized cabin, waiting for a catastrophic breach. I touched the smooth glass of my smartphone one final time. I swiped my thumb to the left, closing the financial ledgers and opening the last file in my encrypted dossier. The ceiling-mounted projector chimed. The complex web of routing numbers and shell company data vanished. In their place, a single stark image illuminated the wall above the antique marble fireplace. It was not a bank statement. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a private text message thread. The timestamps located in the upper margins indicated the digital exchange occurred exactly 5 years ago. I did not need to offer a lengthy preamble. The text bubbles were enlarged, rendering the font clear enough for the oldest aunts at the back of the room to read without adjusting their glasses. The gray outgoing bubble belonged to my mother. The blue response bubble belonged to Trent. I read the blue text bubble aloud, letting my voice carry the heavy, lethal weight of the words into the stagnant air. "Pay the $750,000 to my shell company by Friday. Or I show Richard the DNA test. Harper is not his." The silence broke. It did not shatter with a single sound, but with a chaotic, overlapping chorus of sharp gasps, horrified whispers, and the scrape of wooden chairs pushing backward. The carefully cultivated identity of the Walker family incinerated in a fraction of a second. The financial crimes had exposed my mother as a thief. This text message exposed her as a traitor to the bloodline. I looked at Harper. The golden child sat paralyzed in her carved oak chair. Her weeping had ceased, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. Her mind struggled to process the dual magnitude of the betrayal crushing her reality. Her husband had not just extorted her mother. He had weaponized her own biology to do it. The man she married had discovered her illegitimacy, secretly procured a DNA test, and utilized her genetic secret as a lucrative bargaining chip to fund his failing business ventures. Trent had sold her out for $750,000. Harper turned her head slowly, looking at the tech incubator executive sitting beside her. Trent refused to meet her gaze. He stared fixedly at the white linen tablecloth, his face drained of all remaining color. He was surrounded by wealthy, influential people who now understood the full scope of his depravity. He had infiltrated a dynasty, discovered its darkest vulnerability, and bled the estate dry to maintain his own fragile ego. My attention shifted down the length of the long oak table to the far end. My father, Richard Walker, sat motionless. Richard built his fortune in commercial real estate through calculated risk and steadfast loyalty. He was a quiet, observant patriarch who endured his wife and her theatrical tantrums for the sake of household stability. For over 3 decades, he believed he was providing for 2 daughters. He believed he was nurturing his own biological legacy. Richard slowly raised his hands and pressed his palms against his eyes. He dropped his head forward, his shoulders trembling beneath his tailored suit jacket. A low, agonizing sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire marriage was a hollow, parasitic illusion. He had financed the lavish lifestyle of a child who did not share his blood while watching his actual daughter endure endless targeted cruelty. The revelation recontextualized my entire childhood. I looked down at Vivian. She remained crumpled on the hardwood floor near the marble fireplace. She was not crying anymore. She stared at the floorboards, defeated and exposed. Her lifelong hatred for me suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. "You did not despise me because I was independent," I stated, addressing the broken woman on the floor. My voice was steady, carrying the clarity of a solved equation. "You despised me because I look exactly like my father. I possess his analytical mind, his sharp features, and his exact temperament. Every single time you looked at me, you saw a walking, talking reminder of the man you betrayed." I paused, ensuring the rest of the relatives heard the historical context behind the abuse. "Harper is the product of your rumored affair with your disgraced former business partner," I continued. "She looks like him. She acts like him. You spoiled her and placed her on a pedestal because you were overcompensating for your own staggering guilt. You showered the affair child with unearned luxury to quiet your conscience. You punished the legitimate child because my mere existence threatened to expose your deceit." Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, unable to formulate a single word of denial. "Trent discovered the truth 5 years ago," I explained to the jury of aunts and uncles. "He found the vulnerability in your flawless armor. He knew Richard would file for divorce the moment he saw the DNA test. He knew Richard would freeze the estate accounts, rewrite the inheritance, and cast you out of the high society circles you cherish so deeply. So Trent demanded a ransom, and you forged my signature to pay it. You destroyed your own legitimate daughter to protect the secret of your infidelity." The 35 relatives absorbed the devastating narrative. The social hierarchy they had adhered to for decades was inverted and destroyed. The golden child was illegitimate. The esteemed son-in-law was a blackmailing extortionist. The tragic matriarch was an unfaithful fraudster. Uncle Robert walked away from the mahogany double doors. He approached the head table, stopping directly behind his brother. Robert placed a heavy grounding hand on Richard and his shoulder. The gesture was silent, but it spoke volumes. The Walker bloodline was closing ranks around the wounded patriarch, severing all remaining ties to the woman kneeling by the fireplace. I watched the wreckage settle over the catered turkey and untouched side dishes. The physical artifacts of a traditional Thanksgiving dinner felt absurd in the presence of such profound betrayal. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and imported floral centerpieces were now the backdrop of a structural collapse. The facade of the Malibu estate was stripped away, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth of human greed. I felt a strange, defining peace wash over my shoulders. The invisible weight I had carried since childhood, the pervasive feeling that I was somehow defective or unworthy of maternal affection, evaporated into the cool California night. The defect never resided within me. I was simply the mirror reflecting a guilt my mother refused to confront. Harper lifted her head. Her makeup was ruined, her custom silk gown stained with spilled red wine. She looked at Richard, the man she had called her father for nearly 30 years. She let out a soft, pleading whimper. Richard did not raise his head to meet her gaze. The rejection was passive, but it was total. Harper realized she possessed no standing in this room. Her bank accounts were funded by stolen money. Her marriage was a transactional extortion scheme. Her very biology was an insult to the man sitting at the end of the table. Trent sat paralyzed, trapped between the fury of the Walker relatives and the impending arrival of federal tax agents. He had played a dangerous game of leverage, assuming Vivian would always manage to keep the ledger hidden. He severely underestimated the tenacity of the scapegoat. The tech incubator executive was now a man without a country, lacking the funds to hire a criminal defense attorney and lacking the social capital to escape the fallout. The silence following my final words was different from the previous quiet moments. It was not the silence of shock or anticipation. It was the terminal silence of a dynasty acknowledging its own death. My audit was finished. The receipts were delivered. The truth was projected in high definition for the entire jury to evaluate. Richard slowly lowered his hands from his face. He stood up from his chair. His movements were stiff-aged by the crushing weight of the revelation. He did not yell. He did not throw his crystal water glass or flip the heavy oak table. He turned his back on Vivian and began walking toward the front of the house. The exodus was beginning. The family was about to fracture and scatter into the night, abandoning the ruined matriarch and her extortionist son-in-law. But as I reached forward to disconnect my smartphone from the audiovisual network, I knew one relative remained unaccounted for. One person had not yet witnessed the data projected on the wall, and she held the power to escalate this domestic destruction into total corporate annihilation. Richard Walker stood up. His face, usually flush with the vitality of a seasoned real estate magnate, mirrored the pale gray of dry cement. He bypassed his untouched dinner plate. He bypassed his younger brother. He navigated the perimeter of the dining room without glancing down at the woman he had called his wife for 3 decades. His footsteps fell heavy and measured against the oak floorboards. Vivian reached out a trembling hand, her fingers grazing the hem of his trousers. Richard did not pause. He did not kick her hand away. He simply stepped out of her reach, treating her touch like an inconvenient draft of cold air. He pushed through the mahogany double doors, crossed the grand foyer, and walked out into the Malibu night. He did not ask the staff for his coat. He did not look back at the illuminated windows of his own estate. He did not speak a single syllable. The finality of his silence signaled the official termination of the marriage. The patriarch departing acted as a starting pistol for the remaining guests. The catered Thanksgiving dinner descended into frantic, uncoordinated motion. Aunts and uncles pushed their carved chairs backward in a panicked rush. The scrape of wood against wood created a harsh, discordant symphony. Aunt Patricia abandoned her designer clutch on the table, realizing seconds later she needed her car keys, and lunged back to retrieve the leather purse. Uncle Robert guided his wife toward the exit, keeping his body positioned between his family and the disgraced matriarch on the floor. Nobody offered Vivian a helping hand. Nobody offered a tissue to stem the flow of her ruined cosmetics. The wealthy enclave of the Walker dynasty operated on a strict policy of self-preservation. Associating with a confessed felon carried a toxic social contagion. They crowded the entryway, shouting for the valet attendants to retrieve their luxury vehicles, desperate to put physical distance between themselves and the impending federal investigation. At the head table, the golden child finally found her voice. Harper stood up, her ruined silk gown clinging to her frame. She turned toward Trent. Her prior weeping hardened into a shrill, piercing rage. She realized her entire existence had been commodified. Her husband had not married her out of affection. He had married a lucrative extortion token. She screamed at him, her voice cracking as she demanded to know how long he possessed the genetic test results. She demanded to know how he could smile at her every morning while funneling stolen capital into his failing business. Trent did not offer an apology. A man facing federal wire fraud charges possesses zero capacity for empathy or marital devotion. He stood up, adjusted his cashmere lapels, and shoved past his weeping wife. He clipped her shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling backward into the edge of the dining table. Trent marched toward the exit, pulling his cellular phone from his pocket. He was already dialing the private number of a high-powered criminal defense attorney, leaving Harper alone amidst the spilled wine and shattered crystal. I stood at the front of the room, an island of calm within the scrambling chaos. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, severing the wireless connection to the audio-visual network. The projector screen above the marble fireplace faded to black. The dark canvas rolled upward, disappearing into the ceiling compartment with a faint mechanical hum. I gathered the physical binders I had placed on the linen tablecloth, sliding the heavy forensic portfolios back into my leather tote bag. I zipped the compartment shut. I did not deliver a final monologue. I did not demand an apology. The data had spoken louder than any parting insult ever could. I walked down the center aisle of the dining room, passing the abandoned plates of roasted turkey and imported sage stuffing. I exited the estate, handed my ticket to a stunned valet attendant, and waited for my 5-year-old Toyota Corolla. The drive back to San Francisco offered a profound, unblemished peace. I navigated the winding curves of the Pacific Coast Highway under a canopy of stars. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline replaced the stifling tension of my childhood. I rolled down the window, letting the cool, salty air fill the cabin of the sedan. For the first time in 30 years, I did not carry the weight of my mother and her fabricated expectations. I did not need to constantly monitor my own behavior to deflect her unwarranted criticism. The psychological armor I wore to survive the Walker family holidays rested on the passenger seat, locked inside a leather tote bag, no longer required for my survival. The $750,000 invoice she tried to hang around my neck had shattered her own cage. By Friday morning, the social execution of Vivian and Harper was complete. The digital fallout tracked the physical exodus. I sat at my kitchen counter drinking a cup of black coffee, watching the family group chat update in real time. 34 relatives executed a synchronized retreat. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins removed themselves from the shared messaging platforms. They blocked Vivian on every available communication network. They severed ties with Harper, erasing the golden child from their social media circles. The isolation extended far beyond digital boundaries. High society in Malibu functions like a ruthlessly efficient immune system. Word of the forgery and the impending federal tax audit leaked through the valet attendants and the catering staff before sunrise. The elite circles excised the infection with stunning speed. By noon, the prestigious country club suspended Vivian and her membership pending a formal ethics review. The exclusive homeowner association revoked her access to the private neighborhood tennis courts. Charitable foundations quietly removed her name from their upcoming winter gala invitations, redirecting her uncashed donation checks back to the estate via certified mail. Harper experienced the exact same rapid exile. The women who frequently attended her catered luncheons crossed the street to avoid her. Mother and daughter found themselves trapped together inside the sprawling, empty oceanfront mansion. They were surrounded by the remnants of a shattered holiday, waiting for the inevitable knock of federal agents delivering criminal indictments. They had no allies left to manipulate, no audience left to deceive, and no leverage left to utilize. However, as I tallied the blocked contacts and monitored the social collapse, I noticed a singular glaring omission. 34 relatives had cut ties. There were 35 relatives present at the dinner. I checked the master contact list. Only one person kept their communication channels open. Only one individual refrained from blocking the disgraced matriarch. It was Grandma Beatrice. The 80-year-old billionaire who controlled the overarching generational wealth of the Walker dynasty remained terrifyingly silent. Beatrice did not send a text message. She did not issue a statement through her corporate attorneys. She did not participate in the frantic gossip consuming the rest of the family tree. In the ecosystem of high-finance, silence from Beatrice Walker represented the most dangerous response possible. When the matriarch yelled, she was negotiating terms. When she remained quiet, she was calculating a structural demolition. Beatrice possessed a brilliant, unforgiving mind, and she had just watched her daughter-in-law steal $750,000 from the family ledger to cover up an illicit affair. The quiet Friday morning stretched into the afternoon, the tension building like a localized pressure system. I knew Beatrice was not holding the communication line open to offer Vivian a lifeline or a word of comfort. She was sharpening a blade. And I knew it was only a matter of time before her executive assistant dialed my number. The weekend concluded without a single incoming message from the Malibu estate. The profound silence served as a testament to the swift social exile my mother now endured. I spent Sunday reviewing my own files, ensuring every piece of data remained secure in my encrypted cloud storage. At precisely 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my smartphone vibrated against the granite kitchen counter of my San Francisco apartment. The caller identification displayed a blocked number. I accepted the call, anticipating a desperate plea from Trent or a frantic threat from Harper. Instead, a crisp, highly modulated voice spoke through the receiver. It was Eleanor, the senior executive assistant to Beatrice Walker. Eleanor did not engage in polite pleasantries or ask about my holiday. She delivered a strict, non-negotiable summons. I was expected at the Century City offices of the primary estate attorneys by 10 o'clock that morning. She informed me a commercial flight ticket was already waiting in my email inbox, and a private car would meet me at the Los Angeles airport. I changed into a tailored charcoal suit, the standard uniform of my corporate profession. The short flight down the California coastline offered a brief window to prepare my mindset. Century City represents the hardened steel spine of West Coast wealth. Unlike the breezy cosmetic luxury of the Malibu shoreline, the towering glass structures in this district house, the ruthless architects of corporate power. I stepped out of the black town car and walked into the soaring lobby of the specified high-rise. Security personnel checked my credentials and directed me to the executive elevators. The doors opened on the top floor, revealing a reception area clad in dark slate and brushed steel. Eleanor stood waiting near the reception desk. She offered a curt nod and guided me down a long, soundproofed corridor. We bypassed rows of junior associates working frantically behind frosted glass partitions. Eleanor stopped in front of the senior partner boardroom, turned the heavy brass handle, and ushered me inside. The boardroom featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling urban grid of Los Angeles. Despite the breathtaking view, the true focal point of the room sat at the head of the sprawling mahogany conference table. At 80 years old, my grandmother Beatrice possessed a posture that defied the passage of time. Her silver hair was styled with severe precision. She wore a tailored black blazer, projecting the aura of a reigning monarch observing her domain. Flanking her high-backed leather chair stood 3 men in conservative navy suits. I recognized them from previous corporate retreats. They were senior corporate litigators, the exact specialists you hire when you intend to dismantle a rival enterprise and salt the earth behind them. The air in the room felt thin, chilled by the robust air conditioning and the heavy weight of impending legal action. Beatrice gestured toward the empty leather chair situated directly opposite her position. I took my seat, keeping my spine straight and maintaining direct eye contact. I anticipated a stern reprimand for airing family secrets in front of 35 dinner guests. Wealthy dynasties generally abhor public scandal, preferring to handle betrayals behind closed doors to protect the brand. Beatrice rested her manicured hands on the polished mahogany wood. She did not express a single ounce of anger toward me. Instead, her dark eyes radiated a cold, focused fury directed entirely at the woman who had disgraced her son. She looked at me with an expression resembling profound clinical respect. "You conducted an exceptional investigation." Beatrice began, her voice steady and commanding. She did not waste time discussing the emotional fallout of the Thanksgiving dinner. She focused exclusively on the mechanics of the exposure. She stated she had harbored deep suspicions regarding Harper and her origins for nearly 3 decades. Beatrice recognized the distinct lack of familial resemblance and noted the pervasive, overcompensating guilt that dictated Vivian and her parenting style. The matriarch knew her daughter-in-law was hiding a dark truth, but unverified suspicions do not hold weight in a court of law. Beatrice operated on verified ledgers, not maternal intuition. She explained that confronting Vivian without irrefutable proof would have triggered a messy, protracted legal battle, potentially tying up the estate trusts in years of costly litigation. She needed empirical data to strike effectively. By projecting the wire transfer logs, the internet protocol data, and the DNA extortion text, I had handed the matriarch a fully loaded weapon. Beatrice complimented my methodology, praising the detached, unemotional delivery of the facts. "You did not let them drag you into a hysterical shouting match," Beatrice noted, leaning forward slightly. "You pinned them to the wall with their own receipts. You verified the theft of Richard and his legacy." The ambient sunlight caught the edge of her diamond lapel brooch, flashing a cold, brilliant white. "An auditor identifies the breach," Beatrice said, her voice resembling the sound of grinding stone. "But an executor punishes the guilty." Beatrice turned her attention to a thick, leather-bound portfolio resting on the desk in front of her. One of the corporate litigators stepped forward, opening the cover to reveal hundreds of pages of dense legal text stamped with bright red, urgent filing markers. "The standard protocol for familial betrayal involves simple disinheritance," Beatrice explained. "The average billionaire simply drafts a new will, removing the offending individuals from all future financial distributions." She tapped her index finger against the open portfolio. "I find that approach entirely unacceptable. Simple disinheritance implies that Vivian, Harper, and Trent get to walk away from this disaster, holding on to the spoils of their previous deception. If Beatrice merely cut them out of the will, the antagonists would still retain the millions they had already siphoned over the years. Harper would keep the $2.5 million La Jolla mansion. Trent would retain his tech incubator assets, funded by the stolen equity line. Vivian would continue residing in the Malibu estate, living a life of leisure off the remaining property value. They would survive the scandal and eventually rebuild their social standing, enjoying the luxury funded by deceit. Beatrice refused to let them walk away. She intended to strip them of every single asset gained through manipulation. She wanted them to experience the exact same financial terror they had inflicted upon me. Beatrice informed me that the foundational trust governing the Walker generational wealth contained deeply buried clauses. When she and my grandfather established the corporate empire decades ago, they anticipated potential hostile takeovers from outside predatory entities. They integrated severe sweeping penalties into the corporate bylaws to protect the core family assets. These clauses were designed to execute immediate asset forfeiture in the event of documented corporate fraud or moral turpitude. Beatrice was now activating those exact contingencies against her own daughter-in-law. She was bypassing the standard family court system and utilizing the full weight of commercial litigation. The conflict transitioned instantly from a toxic holiday dispute into a realm of total structural annihilation. The lead litigator distributed copies of the legal filings across the mahogany table. The documents detailed emergency asset freezes, property liens, and aggressive civil lawsuits designed to claw back every stolen dollar. Beatrice was not just punishing them for the immediate theft. She was dismantling their entire foundation. She was utilizing the forged signatures and the extortion plot as the legal catalyst to trigger the poison pill hidden within the estate trusts. I sat in the boardroom, realizing my forensic audit had set the stage for a financial execution of unprecedented scale. The fabricated invoice Vivian tried to hang around my neck was about to cost her everything she owned. The trap was fully armed, and Beatrice was preparing to drop the corporate guillotine. The lead litigator closed the heavy leather portfolio and stepped back into the shadows of the boardroom. The air conditioning hummed a low and steady sound that underscored the severity of the legal strategy just presented. Beatrice Walker did not simply disinherit her daughter-in-law. She utilized the full crushing weight of commercial litigation to execute a financial guillotine. The mechanism of destruction centered on a hidden moral turpitude and corporate fraud clause embedded deep within the foundational bylaws of the generational trust. These stipulations were originally drafted decades ago to repel hostile corporate takeovers. Activating them against a family member required concrete proof of illicit activity threatening the estate. My forensic audit provided the exact ammunition required. Vivian made a fatal, arrogant accounting error during her extortion scheme. In her desperate attempt to hide the origin of the stolen capital, she routed the illicit home equity funds through the primary family trust accounts before wiring the money to the Cayman Islands. She intertwined dirty money with the pristine estate ledgers. That specific act of commingling gave Beatrice and her legal team full jurisdiction to petition a judge for civil asset forfeiture. Because Vivian infected the central trust, the estate maintained the legal right to claw back every single cent she possessed. The trap snapped shut before the sun rose on Tuesday morning. Vivian woke up inside the sprawling Malibu residence, unaware that her financial existence had evaporated overnight. She dialed the private number of an elite white-collar criminal defense firm desperate to retain top-tier legal counsel for her looming federal tax evasion trial. The defense attorneys demanded a standard six-figure retainer up front. Vivian provided her primary banking details. The transaction declined. She provided a secondary routing number. That transaction also declined. A superior court judge had granted an emergency injunction at dawn, locking every personal and joint account bearing my mother and her name. Her credit cards were deactivated. Her investment portfolios were frozen. The swift, unyielding reality of her situation settled in. A high society socialite facing the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service requires aggressive, expensive legal representation. Stripped of her stolen wealth, Vivian possessed zero liquid capital. She will walk into a federal courthouse and face seasoned government prosecutors represented solely by an overworked, underpaid public defender. The corporate guillotine swung with equal precision down the California coastline. Harper woke up in her $2.5 million La Jolla mansion, surrounded by custom furnishings and panoramic ocean views. Her curated, flawless reality shattered when a fleet of county sheriff vehicles parked in her pristine driveway. Uniformed deputies walked up the manicured front steps and taped an expedited notice of foreclosure to the custom glass doors. Because Vivian utilized stolen estate capital to fund the down payment and subsequent mortgage installments for the La Jolla property, the house was legally classified as the proceed of embezzlement. Beatrice and her attorneys executed an immediate repossession order. Harper was granted exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. The golden child who had spent her entire adult life mocking my practical choices was forced to pack her designer wardrobe into black plastic garbage bags while law enforcement officers supervised her exit. Her affluent neighbors watched the eviction unfold from their front lawns, whispering behind their hands. The Instagram-perfect illusion died right there on the pavement. Trent faced a different, far more severe breed of justice. Beatrice did not forget the architect of the extortion plot. Her legal team forwarded the verified wire transfer logs and the Delaware Shell Company registrations directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal regulatory agency immediately classified his tech incubator as a fraudulent enterprise. Trent was legally locked out of his own corporate servers. His shares in the incubator were forcibly liquidated to repay the stolen trust capital, rendering his equity entirely worthless. The venture capital investors who previously funded his flashy lifestyle withdrew their support, running for the exits to avoid the fallout. Trent found himself stranded. He lacked the funds to secure his own legal defense, lacking a home and lacking a wife, as Harper blamed him entirely for their sudden destitution. The extortionist who tried to hold a dynasty hostage was reduced to a penniless outcast waiting for a federal indictment to finalize his ruin. Back in the Century City boardroom, the three corporate litigators gathered their documents and quietly exited the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone with the matriarch. Beatrice sat in silence for a long moment, watching the morning traffic navigate the sprawling urban grid of Los Angeles through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She turned her attention back to me. Her dark eyes reflected a profound, weary clarity. The infection was excised, but the surgical removal had left the Walker empire hollowed out. She reached into the pocket of her tailored black blazer. She produced a small velvet box and placed it carefully on the mahogany table. She pressed her fingertips against the lid and slid the box across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from my hands. "Open it," Beatrice instructed. Her voice held a gentleness I had never heard before. I unclasped the velvet lid. Resting inside on a bed of dark satin was a heavy antique brass key. The metal was cool to the touch, carrying the distinct weight of historical significance. It was the original deed key to the primary Walker estate, the foundational property my grandfather purchased when he first established the family fortune. Beatrice opened a leather folio resting on her desk. She revealed a freshly notarized legal document featuring my name printed at the top. "I spent the weekend rewriting the master trust," Beatrice explained, her tone formal and unwavering. "I have removed Vivian, Harper, and Trent from all future considerations. They hold no claim to this family. They possess no standing in this estate." She tapped a silver pen against the thick stack of paper. "I am naming you the sole executor and the exclusive beneficiary of the $50 million Walker empire," Beatrice stated. "The brass key is symbolic, but the legal transfer of power is binding. You will control the investments. You will manage the properties. You will dictate the future of this lineage." I looked at the brass key, processing the staggering magnitude of the wealth suddenly resting in my hands. I had spent my entire life working double shifts, renting modest apartments, and funding my own independence to escape the toxic gravity of my family. I never desired their money. I only desired the truth. Beatrice recognized my hesitation. She leaned forward, bridging the physical distance across the wide conference table. "They tried to bury you because you were the only one strong enough to carry this family and its integrity," Beatrice said. Her words resonated with an undeniable, fierce conviction. "You did not break under 30 years of unwarranted cruelty. You did not compromise your morals for the sake of comfort. You hunt down fraud for a living, and you brought that exact same relentless justice into your own home. The Walker legacy belongs to you, Audrey. It always did." I closed the velvet box, securing the brass key inside. I nodded once, accepting the responsibility and the closure it represented. 2 weeks later, the final remnants of my past were permanently erased. I utilized my new authority as the estate executor to list the Malibu oceanfront property on the commercial real estate market. The sprawling mansion sold in a matter of days to an overseas technology investor. I did not keep a single piece of furniture or a single photograph from the residence. I liquidated the structure and routed the capital directly into a diversified high-yield investment portfolio. I drove my 5-year-old Toyota Corolla north, leaving the superficial glamour of Southern California far behind in the rearview mirror. I purchased a secluded, stunning fortress of my own in Northern California. The property sits on a rugged cliffside, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by towering, ancient redwood trees. It is a quiet, impenetrable sanctuary built of natural stone and heavy timber. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and salt spray. I sit on my wraparound cedar porch today, listening to the wind move through the forest canopy. The frantic, desperate noise of high society gossip no longer reaches my ears. Vivian and Harper are navigating the bleak reality of the criminal justice system without a safety net. Trent is answering to federal regulators. The people who spent decades trying to convince me I was a disappointment are currently discovering the true cost of their own deceit. My mother sent me an invoice for $750,000 on Thanksgiving. She stood in front of 35 relatives and demanded that I pay for my existence. She wanted to calculate my worth on a fabricated spreadsheet. She underestimated the meticulous nature of a compliance investigator. I audited her lies. I exposed her extortion. I triggered a corporate guillotine that severed her from the empire she so desperately sought to control. I walked away from the wreckage financially whole, legally untouchable, and permanently free. The bill is paid in full. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, we are often sold the myth of the picture-perfect family, the sprawling coastal estates, the catered holiday dinners, the effortless smiles curated for the camera. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, a cultural script that demands unwavering loyalty, sometimes at the staggering expense of our own survival. But sometimes the brightest facades cast the darkest, most suffocating shadows. My journey wasn't just about untangling wire transfers or surviving a Thanksgiving ambush, it was about recognizing a fundamental truth. The labels abusive people assign to us, disappointment, failure, problem child, are rarely about our actual worth. They are desperate projections. They are the heavy coats of guilt and secrecy that toxic individuals force us to wear so they never have to confront their own ugly reflections in the mirror. The greatest lesson I learned is that financial and emotional independence is your ultimate shield. When you build your own life and stop relying on the people who hurt you, you strip away their leverage. You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to hold on to your truth and let the facts speak for themselves. If you've ever sat at a crowded family table and felt like an exile within your own bloodline, I want you to know you aren't alone. Please take a moment to subscribe and follow Eldenly Stories for more narratives about people who stopped shrinking and started taking their power back. We spend so much of our lives trying to decipher the complex ledgers of human affection, hoping the math will eventually reconcile. But perhaps true freedom isn't about balancing the books with the people who broke you. Maybe it's simply having the courage to close their ledger, step out into the quiet night, and wonder, what kind of life could you build if you finally stopped paying a debt you never owed?